Well, good afternoon to all of you joining Grand Rounds in Internal Medicine today. I'm Christophe Lambert, and I'm the Interim Division Chief of Internal Medicine, a professor also in Psychiatry and Computer Science as secondary appointments. And today I'd like to share with you some of the efforts I've made in using artificial intelligence to accelerate systems thinking for conflict resolution and change management. And so I'll be the first in three speakers who will be speaking on translational informatics topics. And you might wonder what systems thinking has to do with informatics, but if you think we're working on modeling reality as scientists and we're using computing to enhance that process. And so it turns out one of the things nearest and dearest to me is that process. You see this scan code here. This will allow you to get CME credit for this presentation. I do have no disclosures for this presentation, no conflicts. And the learning objectives are around understanding how to resolve personal organizational conflict, which is actually a real generator for creativity. Understand how to manage organizational change through multiple stakeholders, or at least develop a plan to do so, and then learn how to use ChatGPT templates to alleviate the cognitive effort of modeling and systems thinking. And importantly, we want to seek win-win options for personal and organizational transformation. As an overview of the presentation, first, I'll just talk a bit about what I mean by systems thinking and a specific discipline called theory of constraints that I have expertise in, and why then would we want to use artificial intelligence to help us with our thinking. We'll talk a bit about large language models. You've probably all heard of ChatGPT, and we'll be using that today. And then we'll talk about, originally I'd intended on two, but I've got a bonus one today, a technique for conflict resolution, a technique for change management with many stakeholders, and a way for planning one's strategy and tactics from a conceptual to concrete level. And maybe we'll touch a bit on ethics of artificial intelligence. So what do we mean by systems thinking? Generally, you're going to start with your specific problem in the concrete world, map it to a general problem. A given systems thinking discipline will have ways to solve that general problem and map it to a general solution. Then you map it back down to your specific solution. So if you've drawn a pathway model of a molecular process, you're doing a form of systems thinking. If you've drawn a picture of your organization on a napkin, you are as well. But importantly, we'll have a specific set of systems thinking tools available to us depending what discipline we use. And I'll be talking about theory of constraints, or TOC, and I'll touch just lightly on another approach, an inventive theory of inventive problem solving. TRIZ is a Russian acronym for an approach for doing innovation. So what is this thing called theory of constraints? It's developed, pictured in this book by Goldratt. It's both a management philosophy and a set of tools and techniques to improve systems. Its central insight is when you're working on a goal-directed system, there's a very limited number of constraints that significantly impact generating more of your goal units, or what we would call your throughput or your flow. And then we have systems thinking tools to pinpoint core conflicts and manage constraints. And as doctors do, rather than having the symptoms be thought of as the cause, you realize there's deeper effects that need to be addressed to get profound system improvement, though the symptoms guide you to find those. Suited for any goal-directed system, be it a corporation, a healthcare system, or your own personal life. And for me, how I came upon it back in the early 2000s was it helped me save my business from going under, both by focusing on what to do and more importantly, what to stop doing, which in an organization with massive multitasking going on, like anywhere in academia, we probably need more attention on what we stop doing. Here's some of my favorite books on the topic, including 3 at the bottom here about healthcare, These three are more about the thinking process, and here's a general introduction through a business novel, as well as a handbook and a book on how to use it in your personal life. So why should we use artificial intelligence for any systems process, but in particular theory constraints? Well, if you have a good mental model of reality, you can make better decisions with respect to your goals. I'm going to argue and have found theory constraints thinking processes provide good models of reality, but most people don't know how to use them. Even experts neglect to use them. They can take a lot of brain power and effort to do. If you've read about Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, there's the idea of our automatic subconscious processes, as well as using our frontal lobes and having to really think things out. And we find systems thinking takes a lot of that brain glucose to really think about a problem. And if we do it all the time, we sort of wear ourselves out. And further, we often find if we're in the system that we're trying to analyze, we often lack objectivity. So I'm going to present today the hypothesis that with good enough, not perfect, I don't know if there is perfect modeling of reality, right? With good enough automation of TOC thinking processes, a non-expert can obtain the benefits of this process. Many more problems can be addressed, so you can boost that system to thinking, enable framing of problems for new options where we might have blind spots, and make a better world through win-win ethics of this systems thinking approach. So you probably almost all have heard about, if not used, ChatGPT or some form of large language model. You can do stuff like type in a prompt, and it actually created a poem for me and about theory of constraints. And how does it work? We're not going to go deep into it, but they do use neural networks in a process called deep learning on a vast corpus of content, both text and code. And what it basically does is condition on the text or the context you've given it, including that corpus and that prompt that you provide next. It basically continually predicts the next token. And a token is not precisely a word or a letter. Sometimes it's a short phrase. Sometimes it's less than a word. But the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy blank dog is the most likely thing to be filled in. It also has when you give it the context of your prompt, it can basically weight everything it's ever read to reference or recall relevant details to bring that to attention of the language model. So we've got these technologies that power chatbots responsive to human input, and it's amazingly good at abstraction pattern matching. However, one needs to be aware of something called hallucinations. It'll make stuff up, sometimes confidently and convincingly. It'll hedge on its responses. Often you can tell it not to do something, like stop apologizing, and it'll do it anyways, or maybe even do more of it. And you can get different answers each time you run it, depending on input changes and parameters you may not be aware of that are running under the hood. They have guardrails to prevent you from doing bad things, but their idea of what's bad is not always what you think is. For instance, asking for the billing codes for suicidality, they try to steer you away for that. But if you're a researcher, that might be totally appropriate. And then they limit how much of a prompt you can put in, which limits as well as how the length of a reply. So you can't feed in a whole textbook, although they've done just that. And so they're giving a limited window on this capability through these chatbots. So there's a nice technical report on ChatGPT-4, the latest model that involves terabytes of information and billions of parameters, and they're finding on many measures that we would think are intelligence or human competence that it's meeting and exceeding most humans' capabilities, depending on the domain. They've also been able to do successfully on USMLE exams in medicine. So we're going to now get into some nitty-gritty of how you can do this for yourself. And the principles for creating a template for systems thinking, or any kind of template really, is you want to define the context to lens in ChatGPT to relevant domains, prep it to distinguish between the structure, sort of the labels you want, plus instructions for populating that structure. I like to use square brackets. And then tell it you're going to be giving it some text after your template. So you sort of have to set it up. I'm going to want you to do this on this text I'm going to give next, and then give the text next. Again, you need these instruction sets that really set out a detailed process. You have to understand your process really well before you can automate it, and then provide the narrative. If you're using the consumer chatbot, you can tell it to prompt you for the narrative, which allows you to sort of maximize how much space you can use to enter your text. There's a programming mode that you give both the prompt and the narrative at the same time that I'll show. So I'm going to show you one of the most powerful tools of theory constraints, but first by example, and then look at the structure of it, something called an evaporating cloud or a conflict resolution diagram, and look at the idea of health equity. Now, we put health equity as one of the highest values and in our vision statement for the HSC. But how does it generate potential conflict when we're trying to achieve health equity? Well, on one hand, to achieve health equity, we need healthcare access. And on the other hand, we need quality care. In order to get healthcare access for all patients, we want to reduce healthcare costs, at least for the patient. And to get quality care, I feel pressure to increase healthcare costs. We notice that there is this direct opposition here between a decision to act to reduce costs versus act to increase healthcare costs. Now, generically, and importantly, in addition to these being mutually exclusive in time or space, reducing healthcare costs, we can imagine how that might jeopardize quality care and how increasing costs might jeopardize access. So the structure of this cloud, which is really the structure of human conflict at a systemic level, is pretty profound, and I think bears some looking into to understand why we struggle with conflicts, why we will present our side of a conflict, what we want and our need, and the other person might say theirs, and we might not see we have a common goal. Is conflict operates at multiple levels of abstraction. I'd argue 4 levels. So remember this conflict here. We had reduce and increase is at 1 level of abstraction. The second level is there's a need here. The third level is a higher order need that actually contains in a non-obvious way this lower order need, and then a common goal, which in fact encompasses both. And this was developed by a gentleman named Kelvin Youngman some years ago, this insight into the superset subset relationship of conflicts. Now, how to see it in the case of health equity? Well, we see that healthcare access is a function of patient affordability as well as system capacity. Quality care, we need, if you could think of access as one aspect of providing quality care. If you deliver care for one person, well, it's not quality in general. And then we need a notion of care excellence, which is what physicians focus on. Well, further, we know that health equity, it's at a higher level of abstraction. It's healthcare quality and healthcare access, but also we have this notion of justice, that there's a notion of fairness in providing care for all. And so the fact that we have a contradiction actually emerges from the interdependence. If these were independent, we wouldn't have a conflict. And so how do we resolve conflicts? We surface the assumptions behind these putative causality arrows. And by the way, these are necessity, but not sufficient cause. So it's not that healthcare and access and quality are the only things for health equity, but we do say that they're required or needed. So we can talk about why health equity requires access. Well, for some, access for some people and not others is unjust, and similarly providing low quality care when high quality care is available is unjust. Why do we believe that reducing costs is needed for access? Well, healthcare requires payment for access, and we serve low-income patients, many of whom cannot afford healthcare costs. We could challenge those assumptions, like what if payment's not required? In some cases, that's true with Medicaid. On the other side, we have why is quality care require increased costs? Well, the standard of quality care keeps rising in terms of expertise, technology, and coordination, driving cost increases. Why are these mutually exclusive in space or time? Well, we can't simultaneously reduce and increase costs because costs are additive. And finally, why does this jeopardize that? Why does cost reduction jeopardize quality? Well, cost reduction does so because providers and facilities are overloaded already, and they're essential for all care and are expensive. And on the flip side, increasing costs jeopardizes access because costs are passed on to patients, many of whom cannot afford existing care prices. Somewhat a bit restating some of this. So a conflict resolution, we seek a win-win of getting both needs met of access and quality. And I'm not going to solve the grand unified issue of access and quality, and it'll be different for different organizations, but a general direction of a solution is that healthcare system patient throughput should grow faster than expenses grow while improving quality and not exhausting the people who support the healthcare system, providers and staff and so forth. So now let's get to how we can do this type of stuff with ChatGPT. So you tell it you're an expert in this thing called theory constraints. And these types of prompts, you could just put this right in ChatGPT. You also have this skill in invention called TRIZ that I'm not going to talk much about, but it can address contradictions directly. And given the narrative provided at the end of the text, frame the conflict, the assumptions, solutions in the 3 parts described next. You'll fill in the portions in the square brackets using the instructions in each with your expertise, where curly brackets are used for verbatim, direct text substitution of earlier phrases you generated. You just ask, solve this problem with theory constraints. You'll get something, but if you guide it to really go through a bunch of steps, you can do a lot better. So this conflict says, well, we need to define the common goal, the 2 needs, and the 2 things that oppose one another, and give a rationale why you think these stem from the narrative. And the detail here I'm going to gloss over, and this is sort of for posterity if you want to try this yourself. So that's step 1 of 3. Step 2 is define the assumptions. So all those assumptions I showed, why, is B required for A, C for A, D for B? Why does D jeopardize C? Why does it D prime jeopardize B? And why are they mutually exclusive? And you'll notice I'm asking it to sort of structure a sentence, sometimes do direct text substitution, and then give it very specific instructions about how to do it. On the previous slide, I was finding it would create these messy phrases, and I said use just one noun with an optional adjective preceding it to just get the essence of what we want to define a conflict. So anyhow, this is the assumptions, and then solutions. Well, a solution that challenges each of these respective assumptions. And then I'm going to use this TRIZ thing that can resolve contradiction of D and D prime. If something's contradictory, it can't simultaneously exist in space or time. And so you try to split it up in space or time, or an aspect of space and time is by parts or by degree, or by this condition do it and that condition do the other thing. And so optionally, you can create ugly looking markdown, which if you visualize it, you can create tables. You can kind of see that this evaporating cloud is here, and here's all of the assumptions, or actually the instructions for the assumptions. And then here's instructions for breaking the assumptions and providing different solutions that attack each one of the assumptions. Generally, we mostly will attack the jeopardy assumptions. Sometimes we can do the most creative solutions, look at why two things are mutually exclusive. Sometimes the paradigm itself can be questioned, is like, why do we even need, this for the common goal or that for the common goal? But that's more uncommon that you can do that. And so let's give a little healthcare example. University of New Mexico Hospital has the highest percentage occupancy of any academic medical center in the nation, with wait times of months and years for existing patients who receive care for many specialties. Should also take on the care for inmates of the Metropolitan Detention Center. Of course, we're doing this, so this is not a future decision, but back then one might have looked at that question. And so you can, all my template is above here, and then I say, prompt me for the narrative, and then populate the above template. And then ChatGPT says, please provide me the narrative. So when you have a big, long, messy problem, which I just did a short one for example purposes that could have a lot of detail, you have plenty of space to put it in, because they have limits of about a couple thousand words, give or take, maybe sometimes 4,000, depending on the model. And so then it, generates this version of the evaporating cloud content. Well, we want patient well-being, we want accessibility, and we want institutional responsibility. Prioritize existing patients versus do not prioritize existing patients. And we can spit that out into a tabular form and list the assumptions. This was an earlier version of the template that missed these two jeopardy assumptions. Apologies on that. So you can generate that markdown, and then you can generate markdown for the solutions. And there's some interesting things like separate patient care by type or urgency, or allocate specific days or times for inmate care. Interesting ideas, may or may not apply. Establish scheduled care program for inmates, ensuring they receive attention without causing delays for existing patients. Set a quota or allocate dedicated resource for inmates without compromise the resource of existing patients. So those jeopardy assumptions. Some idea of triage systems, some idea of collaborating with other medical centers to address some of the assumptions, even some ideas of telehealth. So interestingly, you can try running it a second time and get a different formulation. Here's accessibility and quality. Here, both framing the problem and then the solution. And then you can apply to have access to sort of a programmatic interface for ChatGPT. So for the informatics folks who want to program, and you can basically sort of put the system chunk here, which is your prompt, put the actual thing that you want to ask about, and then you can get it to generate the solution. And there's different parameters about temperature. Usually put the length at about half of the maximum. And temperature 0 says, give me the same answer every time. Moving higher temperatures, you can get more and more random types of solutions. Importantly, there's a little code button here, and you can basically get Python code that can call and specify your prompt, and you can basically get the answer back in a structured dictionary format in Python. So one thing I'd like to look at in the future is, how you could chain together different prompts, including prompts that could assess the previous step and create variations on it and sort of do what if scenarios. So some thoughts on this evaporating cloud. I found, I'm going quickly here, but you can get some surprisingly insightful conflicts, and they do much better than most beginners and many experts. The variety you can get in models, I like to think of it as a feature to generate options. You can hit regenerate again and again in the GUI version of ChatGPT and get different framings. And then you can pick one you like and say, proceed with the analysis. I have found that ChatGPT struggles sometimes to get the levels of abstraction the same as I would assign them, but I think that's in part because language is really not precise with many of our abstract terms. So I'm going to switch gears to a second theory constraints tool called the change matrix. And it's a basic metaphor that I'm going to ask you to do a change, and you say, well, why should I do the change? I say, well, there's a pot of gold up there on that mountain. You say, well, wait a minute, it's dangerous to go up that mountain. And on the other hand, you say, well, there's a big alligator at the bottom that might bite your legs if you stay here. And you say, well, but there's this lovely mermaid that lives down at the bottom of the mountain, or a merman, that I don't want to leave and can't go up the mountain with me. So this is kind of an extension of really Ben Franklin's pros and cons list, where you look at the pros and cons of the change versus the status quo. And I'm going to switch gears here to just show a little video to kind of illustrate this.
No one will listen. Hey, Martin, what's wrong? I've had enough of this. Every change I've suggested is knocked down. It's impossible to change anything around here. And maybe your suggestions are no good? That's nonsense. You know why it happens. Everybody knows. It's because people resist change. Resist. You are wrong. I don't resist change, and neither does the average Joe. Everyone has pushed for major changes in his or her life. Many young people leave their home, choose to get married, prefer children, and show me somebody who resists the change of a promotion at work. Can you really fool yourself that you don't resist change? I resist only the changes that I have a good reason to resist. The others I accept. Baloney! Try me. Okay, I'm game. Making a change is like climbing a mountain. Here's one. Climb it. Don't think so. Haha, you see? You do resist change. I don't resist change. I resist this particular change because I don't have a reason to climb the mountain. I don't see the plus in the change. What's a good reason for you? A higher salary, better health, or an improved relationship. Okay, I'll take care of your excuse. There's a pot of gold waiting for you up there. Is that good enough? Now will you climb? Nope. Point proven. You most certainly resist change. Of course I resist this change, and with good reason. See for yourself. Too much effort, too much time, too high a risk. It's perfectly logical. The minus of the change outweighs the plus of the change. Another excuse. Fine, I'll reduce the required efforts and the risk. Now are you willing to climb? I don't think so. Aha! I knew it. Excuse after excuse. You remove one, another one pops up. The end result is still the same. The change is definitely good for you, and yet you still resist. But it's not good for me. I don't want the change because I'm comfortable in my current situation. Another excuse. Not at all. You look at it too narrowly. No wonder people reject your suggestions. What? I looked at both the plus and the minus sides of making the change. Yes, but you've ignored the pluses of not changing. I like my profession. I like the city I'm in. I like my style of living. I like my mermaid. But she cannot climb the mountain with me. You've just proved my point.
Maybe you justified it logically, but at the end of the day, people will always resist change. They can simply declare that they have a mermaid, and there goes any chance of causing a change out the window.
I'm not looking for excuses, but unlike you, I'm not in love with your suggested change. I'm more objective.
Oh, so you're Mr. Objectivity, huh? The guy who only looks at the plus side of staying the same? Aren't there minuses as well?
I guess there are.
Think of situations that if things stay as they are, alligators will bite your ass off. Your firm may go bankrupt, or your spouse may ask for a divorce, or your health will decline drastically. Aren't you fighting alligators? Constantly. Sometimes I feel that the people I try to convince are so busy fighting off the alligators that they should be climbing the mountain, even if there is no pot of gold waiting at the top. Everybody resists change, including you.
Not at all. Show me how the pot is large enough for me, and the teeth of my alligator are sharp enough, and my effort and my risk to change is not as big, and that I don't have to give up on a beautiful mermaid, then I assure you I will climb the mountain.
That's what I do, and it doesn't work.
Really? Have you ever tried to present all four sides of your suggestion? Let me ask you a more pertinent question. Did you figure out in advance what the pot is for the person you're trying to convince? Not your pot, but his or her pot. What is his or her crutch? What are the alligators and the mermaids for the other party?
I guess not.
There you go. Also, when you concentrate on one aspect and the other person concentrates on another, you are bound to miscommunicate.
Looking at all four factors and doing it from the other party's perspective sounds like a lot of preparation. Are you sure it'll pay off?
Not if you believe that people are programmed to resist change, or any change.
I guess I'll never know unless I give it a try. I'll let you know how it went.
So to reiterate, how one manages change is you want to increase the perceived size of the alligator if you keep the status quo down here. Increase the size of the pot of gold, top of the mountain. Reduce the risk of breaking your leg going up the mountain. And figure out how to retain your mermaid or merman while leaving the status quo. Perhaps bring that merman up in an aquarium. Last year, I facilitated a workshop with 30 people who were interested in their challenges with informatics for neuroscience. And we were able to generate the pain points. There were a lot of things, but we took 200 Post-it notes and found that the vote of the people, so to speak, were these counts here are the votes that each thing got. And you can see there were some challenges: computation, dependence on analysts, data difficult to deal with in the status quo, bureaucracy. The benefits they wanted, and we didn't even specify the change. We just said, imagine a good change, a brighter future. What would it look like? And they were very interested in pipelines, protocols, personnel, staff, making a difference with clinical translation, having impact. Of course, they were concerned that things wouldn't work out so good if whatever changes were suggested. And finally, it was most interesting, the mermaid or merman quadrant has the most, the stuff that's really around security and identity. For instance, loss of control, being sort of the big fish in a small pond where one might have an impact if one was to change the system. And so this was just characterizing the change, but didn't do anything to surface the assumptions. So I think we did this all in a 1-hour workshop. And question is, can we use ChatGPT and create a template to do this and not only figure out quadrants for different stakeholders, but also propose solutions? And so again, you're an expert and you know this allegory, so I restate the allegory. But furthermore, I want you to do the following template 3 times after identifying the 3 stakeholders. And so first, the next steps to define the goal, and then define the stakeholders, either a name or a category of person, if it's sort of a general description. And then stakeholder analysis, do one table per stakeholder, S1, 2, and 3 denoted as S question mark, BOINC, and this is represented in markup to ChatGPT, but much easier to see. You basically list the positives of list the change, list the status quo. And so it has to distill the essence of a change or a status quo. Sometimes it even proposes a change for you if you don't have one in the text. And then after listing, and here I'm just listing 3 bullets of each, I ask it to distill the essence of it so you can get the gist of the overall pattern. And then the solution, basically, you make list causal assumptions of why, for instance, keeping the status quo, you're not going to get that pot of gold, why the change will have this undesired consequence, why if I make the change, I'm going to lose this good thing I have now, we call the mermaid, and why if I stick with the status quo, I'm going to keep my alligator. And so the same template, we don't even have to enter it multiple times, we just list it once. We can use for one stakeholder or for a combination. So continuing our earlier example, it finds 3 stakeholders: the hospital administration, the patients, the administration, the patients at the hospital, and the inmates at the Metropolitan Detention Center. And the change is expand care to include them versus keep things the way they are, which already has high occupancy and long wait times. And so you can see for this first stakeholder, the administration, they envision increased access for the inmates, better reputation for the hospital, maybe additional funding. And that summarizes gain expanded patient base and resources. Downside is they could strain our existing resources, increase wait times, and potential staff burnout, which is summarized there. And we want to retain what we already do have in terms of operational capability. And then we've got, of course, the alligators that we have. So without going into all the depth of this, just from that one paragraph in this template, we've identified 3 stakeholders, identifying the pros and cons of the status quo and the change. And here's for the patients. So they could gain improvements. Sorry, from the hospital resources, they might get negative impacts on their care, so forth. And finally, the inmates. And then we say, look, distill this all into a multi-stakeholder statement. And so the pain is retain limited healthcare access and miss growth potential. The benefit is gain that access and resources. The crutches gain strain and care challenges. And we want to retain our existing focus and resource allocation. And so you can see that those are not a bad characterization potentially of that from of course, such a very short description of the situation. Now, here we can actually list different assumptions and then distill the essence of it and the essence of a solution. So because the status quo limits healthcare access I should say, you try first to figure out how can I get the pot of gold, but mostly keep the status quo? How can I, make the change, but reduce, the risks? How can I make the change, but not lose my benefits? And how can I keep the status quo, but reduce the downsides? And so it kind of gives you 4 ways of looking at improving the situation or making the change without unintended consequences. And interestingly, the change matrix is just another evaporating cloud hiding in plain sight. So I've got a goal, and I want to, on one hand, avoid breaking my leg and retain the mermaid. On the other hand, I want to gain the pot of gold or move the alligator, keep the status quo to avoid breaking my leg and keep my mermaid, make the change to get the benefit of this pot of gold and remove the pain that I have. And of course, almost every change we have that push-pull between keeping the status quo or making the change. And some of those solutions we're looking, well, can we keep the change in part, keep the status quo in part and make the change in part, or vice versa? And there's even some options one can look at of neither doing either of these options, but a completely new situation to resolve both. But I did not develop that in the template. And so some thoughts on the change matrix is, again, the better we can be at conflict resolution, it can lead to better change management. Few people are going to go through the work of analyzing all stakeholders, but large language models can automate that and generate novel insights. And again, variety in models is a feature. Finally, I'd like to talk about strategy and tactics. So many times when people think, what is strategy? Well, it's something up here that's abstract, and tactics is somewhere down there. But, one person's strategy could, definition of strategy could be very different than another person's strategy. And in this theory-constrained strategy and tactics tree, we look at redefining strategy as what we want accomplished, and tactics is how we go about doing it, but doing it at multiple levels of conceptualization. And everything from a long-term conceptual plan to a short timescale concrete actions. And so what you basically look at is the tactic, the how gets expanded into multiple strategy tactic pairs. And so strategy and tactics tree, again, one challenge we have when we try to work out a plan is we have not articulated our assumptions about reality as to why we're going to do something. And of course, it takes some work, and you define, why a strategy is necessary, what the end statement of it is, what assumptions led you to get there, how you're going to actually do it. And then when you think about carrying it out at the next level of detail, what warnings do you need to consider? And then this tree can become a project plan that gets executed from left to right at the very bottom of the tree, and it could turn into a Gantt chart. And if you start executing your strategy, you do the tactic, and the objective doesn't get accomplished, you can then look at, well, what was wrong about our assumptions, but they're actually there and stated. And it turns out, again, strategy, what we want is to achieve the goal via some necessary conditions. And then the tactic is, if we're going to do a breakthrough tactic, we can resolve the conflict between doing two things that seem to lead to mutually exclusive, like increased costs versus reduced costs, and get a win-win tactic. So forward to the next slide. So again, you're now an expert in doing strategy and tactics trees. Please prompt me for some text and work out this template. Basically, I restate the cloud stuff. I'm going to simplify the assumptions, just looking at jeopardy and the direct conflict. I'm going to expand out for creative solutions. Think about explicit solutions with separation in space-time, parts, degree, and then do a synthesis of all of that. And then populate with the cloud content and give it the narrative and let it run. And so I'm going to give a little example of Mary, a diligent medical student without a job. She generously lends items to friends, goes above and beyond for her family. Even with her brother having a lucrative job, she allows him to live with her rent-free, a decision supported by her parents, who argue they've given her financial assistance, overlooking the fact they've given him the same amount. Despite extending herself, she regularly faces dignity violations. Her friends return her belongings damaged without any apology, and her brother's free stay, given his means, adds to her feeling being taken advantage of. or taken for granted rather. All the while she's strained emotionally and financially, juggling family expectations and mounting medical school debt. So, I had it generate a conflict. You can then say, oh, give me 5 alternatives. And then you can pick one of those alternatives or do your own and say, redo the analysis with the following. And so in the case of Mary, I finally said, look, I want you to develop it where her goal is self-esteem. She's seeking acceptance on one hand, and she's needing self-love on the other. And she has in a push-pull between putting others first versus not putting others first. So the highest level strategy and tactic tree is, well, to maintain a balanced sense of self-worth in relationships, it's essential to prioritize self-love and acceptance. Her strategy, achieve self-esteem through acceptance and self-love. These assumptions are, the main assumptions here are it's necessary to have self-esteem because feeling valued and recognized by peers and family contributes to your self-worth. And self-love is necessary to have self-esteem because recognizing, valuing oneself prevents feelings of being used or overlooked. And then she's going to have a conflict, compromising between either putting others first or not, because while prioritizing others can lead to reduced self-love, not doing so can jeopardize acceptance. It's basically listing those jeopardy assumptions. And it's possible to obtain both acceptance and self-love if Mary can set boundaries, communicate her feelings, and ensure she has time for herself. So the tactics are establish clear boundaries in relationships and responsibilities, allocate dedicated self-care periods daily, communicate her needs to family and friends to ensure mutual respect. Now, when we think of how those tactics might be carried out, there's some extra assumptions that you need to worry about. So while implementing these tactics, Mary must ensure she doesn't alienate those around her or become too isolated. It's about balance, not extremes. Furthermore, boundaries must be communicated clearly and not in a way that seems accusatory or resentful, and the focus should be on her feelings and needs rather than the perceived shortcomings of others. Okay, well, this is the highest level strategy to get self-esteem through acceptance and self-love. And I say, okay, recursively use the instructions I already did to create child nodes, and I link up basically one develops new conflicts for the tactics, and expands it out. And boom, we can expand the highest level strategy and tactic into one, the strategy of respect, getting self-care and a routine, healthy relationships through personal boundaries and mutual understanding. And then she's going to create an environment of trust, self-care practices, flexible boundaries. And then further, there's how to have these conversations with friends, financial clarity, parent-child respect, getting herself rejuvenated mentally, physically, emotional balance, emotional security, financial independence, and relational harmony through assertiveness and empathy. So it's expanding out the boundaries, expanding out the self-care, expanding out the respect. So all of this was auto-generated, and behind each of these is the full detail of each of those boxes that characterizes the conflict and the assumptions. So this is still much work in process. I find, good framing of conflicts has a large bearing on results. And so if we improve the conflict template, can improve the strategy tactics. Interesting thing is this template forces a discipline that few, even experts, can adhere to. So AI can enhance our quality, speed, and rigor of planning. And the win-win ethos, of conflict resolution and the ability to, suggest unintended negative consequences goes beyond most human planning. We're often so in love with our change that we don't think of the negative consequences. And the other person who sees the change we're in love with actually sees more of the negative consequences. And then people butt heads rather than depersonalizing it and looking at it as a conflict between two necessary needs that are both important for success of a change. So if you think like, what is this idea of win-win? When two systems interact with respect to their goals, it should improve both of the system's fitness now and or in the future. Sometimes you'll defer your gains to the future. I'll loan you something and you give me something in the future. That's still win-win. If we're the mutual exchange of value. Often we see win-lose. Two systems interact and one party reduces the other system's fitness at the expense of the other, which often devolves into lose-lose, where you know, you're basically sucking up all of your bandwidth in conflict, and that's the lose-lose. And so the win-win is the combined possibilities of a united set of two systems, me and you working together, this and that organization working together. The sum's greater than the parts. Win-lose is you're basically taking options from the loser in an interaction, and lose-lose is that people are canceling out their variety or options. Finally, on ethics, so theory constraints, at least for me, some argue otherwise, is a philosophy. It has a metaphysics that there is an objective reality with no contradictions, and that it's inherently simple in terms of causality. We have methods in epistemology to improve our understanding and improve goal-directed systems through constraints and thinking tools. And those tools seek win-win. We seek to ever improve our systems, and we actually start with the assumption that people are good. May not always be true, but it's a good starting assumption. And we seek wins for both the individual and the collective. And what's thought of as beautiful is inherent simplicity and harmony. So if through the actual way that we work on our problems is baked in win-win, will the world be a better place? And even if artificial intelligence sort of runs wild, but it is guided to do the same, maybe there'll be win-win between us and artificial intelligence in the end. So with that, I'd like to thank you all, and I'll turn it over to any questions or discussion. So there was one question in the chat about a slide saying UNM has the highest occupancy of any academic medical. It was percent occupancy that was being said. So yes, we're very overloaded, and I've been told we are at, if not now, at least have been at the highest. You know, we're at 130, 140% occupancy. That was part of the emergency provisions that allowed us to do, you know, extra measures. Anyone like to type in a question or ask something? Please unmute yourself. So I started this process. I would paste in a news article and would frame the conflict. I even could tell it, all right, after framing the conflict, generate an interesting headline that would sort of show those two opposing poles, and generated enormously good headlines. As I've shown this apparently simple but deep tool of understanding conflict, I've found it's changed the way how I approach interpersonal interactions, how I look at organizations, how I look at, you know, it's not us, them, it's someone asked, what does AI think of the Russia-Ukraine conflict? I haven't tried that. So it's an interesting thing where in order to have a well-formed conflict, you have to have a common goal. So if people are at such a place where, like, I want you dead and I want you dead, there's not really a common goal, right? So you have to, but yet you'll find realities rarely like that. So if you look at what, what are the needs of the different parties, the need is not to, totally decimate and obliterate the other side. The need might be a security need. It might be a protection from Western expansion need. It might be a independence need. It might be an autonomy need. So you want to think through that lens of, there are sort of simplistic conflicts, like I want the cookie and DJ wants the cookie, and he wants all of the cookie and I want all of the cookie, and there's we're both 4 years old and holding on to our, fighting for that one cookie, and even then, yeah, you can cut the cookie, and we get into something like compromise, but the ideal is to strive not for compromise, because we're all used to that, oscillating between compromises, but trying to find breakthrough solutions that don't compromise the separate needs. Oh, I saw Henry appear.
I'll ask a question.
Yes, Henry.
Yes. So what lies behind the complexity of human decision-making is our ability to kind of resolve the tension between kind of instrumental rationality, how to do something, versus value rationality, why to do something. So how would you use AI to capture this really important sorting between instrumental rationality and value rationality, so that the tension that ends up being resolved delivers us the right path?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I would say that the structure of the evaporating cloud is just that, right? Those two needs, B and C, are instrumental, and the two, or are value, and the two actions, D and D prime, are conflicting actions. And and it actually harkens back to like Hegel's dialectic. And so, you have this thesis and antithesis, and then you have a new synthesis that can improve the system, but then it generates a new conflict as you move step up and up and up. And so what you'll find is you actually go up the hierarchy of values as you resolve sort of the more uglier conflicts, and you get up into something approaching things like self-actualization as you work through these conflicts. There's a guy who did like 100 clouds over 100 days, and he felt like it just like it got deeper and deeper and more profound, and eventually, though, it starts actually bouncing off questions of our identity and our basic values. And so I think it is a path of self-actualization and growth, and to be able to project into a diagram something that just swirls around in our heads gives us an extra capability of using our visual system to look at a concrete representation of a rather, abstract, challenging representation at 4 levels of abstraction in our mind that we're not very good at juggling, and actually do something about it. And so to the extent that AI can do that either for us, or at least give us options, right? Give us ways of seeing problems that we haven't seen before. I think it's a step above, because most folks have never been exposed to this notion of the structure of human conflict in this enormously powerful 5-box diagram that I've found has been transformative for my life.
Well, thank you for helping me to understand AI so much better today. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're at the end of our hour, folks. So thank you very much for your attendance and your interest in this. And feel free to contact me if you'd like to learn more.